All right. Hey. Wait. Rishab? Awesome. Kenya?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Did Arthur get here? Or Sekou? No, not yet. Okay. So, when I tell people to weigh, they're like, how do I weigh? Here are 10 ways to weigh that we came up with. There's going to be some overlap with the... Hey, Arthur. There's going to be some overlap with the list of like voter section stuff because a lot of these arguments are related. But still, this should be like a pretty good list that you can refer back to. Some of these arguments are also more obscure. Like they're not going to be the type of things you can read every single round. But I'll throw a few up there to start. So the first one is verifiability of abuse. So it could be that in certain cases, for example, things like disclosure or the abuse story relies on something that happened out of round, or things like predictability, the claim is inherently less likely to be probable because of the fact that it's unverifiable, i.e. there's no immediate mechanism by which the judge can check whether something is in the topic lit, things like that. So think of this as like your form of a probability argument on theory that says that there's like a decreased likelihood of their arguments being true because they're unverifiable.
Yeah, I think this is a very strategic argument against topic literature because people just make the most ridiculous topic lit arguments. Like, no one ever, you can't just assert that the topic literature only has util offense in it. Like, that's such a strong claim to make and no one ever has evidence for it. So I think it's a very valid argument to make if you have, like, claims that don't rely on some sort of empirical assessment or something that the judge doesn't have any capacity to verify.
If at any times you have questions about any of these, what they mean or how to apply them, or objections to them, please raise your hand and share your thoughts. Do not feel afraid to. Okay, so, right, the next one is severity. This should be obvious, but it's just like how abusive something is, like how severe the abuse is. So explain why like something made it like more difficult for you to win the round than it did for them, right? So you're putting some level of like defense on their fairness claims. Okay, the next argument is in-round abuse versus norm setting. Who remembers this distinction from yesterday? Good job. Bless you.
Norm setting is like setting a precedent for future rounds, and in-round abuse is like what someone does in the round.
Yeah, exactly. So again, although like we all seem to be like split, like a lot of us were on the norm setting side, and some of us were on the more like in-round abuse side. Like there are weighing arguments to be made for either one, right? So you could claim like my theory shall like sets a norm so it outweighs. Seems to be like a slightly implausible argument because voting on theory in one round has never like really set a norm. The better version of the argument is like in-round abuse outweighs. It's more verifiable. The judge has more jurisdiction to vote on it because it's something that they can immediately see. Also, because like the judge can't be concerned with like what the effect of their decision is going to be on future rounds. They just have to pick who the better debater is. Things like that. Okay, next is just like voter section weighing. This is also fairly intuitive, but things like fairness outweighs education, education outweighs fairness, right? Or weighing between like specific methods of getting to fairness or education. Like predictability is more important than ground because it doesn't matter if I have ground, like if I'm not able to do any research for the round, or something like critical thinking is more important than topic education because the education we get about a topic will only be relevant like a couple of times in our life, whereas critical thinking skills will like apply every day. Things like that, right? Kinds of weighing arguments between the like impacts of your standards.
And also between voters themselves.
And also, yes, also between the voters themselves, definitely. Like fairness education. All right, the last one I'll throw up here is like structural versus substantive abuse. Usually you'll see this argument manifest itself in like the structural abuse outweighs form. But Arthur, can you explain the distinction between structural and substantive abuse as we discussed it?
Like substantive abuse just makes debating harder than like structural abuse would like alter the way that like you create like substantive arguments in the first place.
Yeah, it like alters the burden structure. Yes, I add to that. Yeah, it changes the burden structure. Good. Yeah, it took me like a year to understand that, so you all are pretty good. Okay. Any questions about those 5? All right, I can write them as you say them. 5 more.
Thanks, Jack. So more arguments. One thing to note is that I think everything that can be a reasonability bright line can also be used for weighing arguments on theory. So things like, I have a solvency advocate, or like the plan is disclosed, can be things that you're using to like mitigate offense onto their interpretation. And those are things that you can utilize to like magnify the offense that you have access to. So I think actual view potential, which is also like a reasonability bright line, people will sometimes say like potential abuse doesn't matter because the judge doesn't have the jurisdiction to vote for it. That's also a good weighing argument to make. So things about like advocacy shifts where you're like, it's not necessarily the case that I would have shifted. It's just like pure speculation about like what potentially could have happened. So you should prefer abuse claims that actually occurred in the round where there was some sort of ground loss, rather than things that are speculating about what like could potentially be the case.
This is especially good against like spec shells,
Yeah.
right? If you're weighing like one of your theory against a spec shell, just be like, I haven't shifted yet.
Yeah.
And the judge, you can't like vote me down just because like there was the possibility for me to do something bad, right? Like you could do anything bad anytime. You could stab your opponent with your pen. That you shouldn't be punished for having a pen.
Yep. This is the biggest one, and this is probably what the best arguments are going to be. It's just going to be strength of link claims. So like reasons why you're accessing stronger strength of link to your like standards level arguments or to your voters than they are. So does anyone like not know what strength of link is? Yeah, sure. So strength of link is like how strong your connection is, or like between like your interp and your standard. It would be like how strong your connection is between the interp and the particular standard. So like really strong strength of link to a ground standard might be like there's literally only one argument I can read against this plan. But like smaller strength of link would just be like there are only 100 arguments I can read against the plan. So it's just like the stronger the argument is.
I think like the best case to use strength of link weighing is if someone is doing voter section weighing and they're claiming that fairness like outweighs education or something like that, you can make an argument that says, look, even if fairness outweighs education in the abstract, I have really, really strong links to education and they have really, really weak links to fairness, right? So even if technically fairness comes first, their link to it is so small that you should prefer education, right?
Yeah.
So what matters is not just the impact weighing, but how we get to the impact, right?
Yeah.
So like there's also the equivalent on like a util debate, right? Just because you win that like helping the environment is more important than the economy doesn't mean that any policy that helps the environment a little bit is automatically going to be better than anything else, right? It depends on how much it hurts the economy and how much it helps the environment.
Yeah. I think it's also very useful for intershell weighing. Like if you're winning an interpretation and you have strong offense on it, and then they're winning an interpretation and you have like really strong defense, that would be like a good reason why your shell outweighs. The next argument is like claims that are justified by side bias. So you can say things like neg abuse outweighs af abuse outweighs neg abuse. Af abuse outweighs will generally be an argument that's like my abuse was like only occurred because the af was unfair. It's just basically like a you started it argument. I can't believe people win rounds on you started it, but they do.
Also, you could use it. You could also use it to like impact turn a fairness claim or mitigate it by saying like, yes, I was being unfair, but it compensated for the fact that the AF is like already structurally at a disadvantage. So that's not exactly weighing. It's more like an impact turn or defense you would put.
Yeah.
But if you're going to use it for weighing, it would be like weighing between shells, like prefer the neg shell because it's harder to negate, or prefer the neg shell because over the 1AR shell because even though I did something abusive, I was forced into doing it by the fact that their AF was not T or something like that.
Yeah. The next argument is just T outweighs theory. The arguments for this are pretty straightforward. They're generally just like jurisdictional claims / textuality come before theoretical claims because they determine what it means to affirm or negate. So it's sort of this like higher level question. And then also people will make a similar argument that's like, if you weren't topical, I'm going to do a lot of terrible, unfair things in order to compensate. Yeah. So I think that's pretty much it. Does anyone have any questions about anything?
Was there not a 10th one? Did I lie about there being 10?
No, there was a 10th one, but you said it already.
Aww. Did I?
Yeah.
We'll put it up there.
You said voter section.
Okay. Interstandard weighing. This is really just an expansion of I think when I said voter section weighing, I just said inter-standard weighing. But like, inter-standard weighing is like predictability outweighs ground, critical thinking outweighs topic education. Voter weighing is more like fairness outweighs education, right? Like the terminal impact of each of those arguments. So I should have separated those out. Inter-standard weighing. So next time your judge says that you should have weighed more, for your redo, you can go back and make 10 weighing arguments. That'll show them. Any questions about these? Anything anyone would add to them? It's quite possible this is not a comprehensive list. Anyone made a weighing argument that was slightly different before? No, I think we happened upon the final and all-completing list of any argument you can make to weigh between theory shells. That's awesome.
Amazing.
All right.
Cool. If there aren't any questions, we're going to jump into theory versus the K.
Okay, yeah. So theory versus the K. This is a debate that is made difficult for the theory debater to win when one of two things is true. Either one, they're reading a shell with really terrible links to fairness, or two, they're just reading their generic fairness first block, and they're not actually doing any nuanced analysis about why fairness is important for evaluating the critique. Who's pulling up the block that says fairness first because they don't want to engage. Never be the person that doesn't want to engage. Theory is your method of engagement. It is your method of saying, here's like a better way we should have had this discussion, right? So if you make like specific arguments about why your interpretation would have led to a better critical discussion, or it was necessary to even get the discussion off the ground in the first place, you'll be ahead on this debate if it is specific to the critique and the theory shell question.
Yeah, so that means don't read that like spec shell everyone has with like 7 planks about
like
things
must
that,
spec roll the ballot.
Yeah,
Never read
it
shell.
Because judges will just be like you're so perceptually at a disadvantage when it's like you pulled up the one theory shell that your team has prepared against K's. And it makes it very, very hard to like answer a lot of their arguments persuasively. Okay,
so here are like 3 or 4 of the most common arguments for theory outweighs the K you should be familiar with. Who can give me one of them? Any argument they've heard for why theory outweighs the K?
Theory logically precludes cross-applications from the K since it determines whether or not you have access to the K.
Yeah, so I think this is like one of the stronger arguments. It's about the truth value of the K, right? So I'll just call it like the truth value argument. So when people like cross-apply the critique to theory, it won't make sense because of the fact that the theory shell indicts your ability to answer the critique. Like if there is a fairness violation, then there was something that prevented you from engaging with the criticism. So now the judge doesn't even have the jurisdiction to say the K is true because it wasn't fairly tested.
Any other arguments people have heard?
Anyone seen like the Galloway card before? No? No one? Yeah, you have? Alright, what does it say? One of you.
It says that like in order to give respect to the other debater, or like to make debate a true dialogue and give respect to both debaters, we need to have some sort of fairness for this.
Another argument. Okay, so this argument, popular in the Galloway card, but you could also just make it analytically, that fairness allows for productive discussion. So fairness leads to good discussions. If we're not on a level playing field, then it's impossible for the dialogue to get off the ground.
I think there's another important claim the Galloway card makes. Does anyone want to take a stab at it? Okay, well, the Galloway card also says, like, the only way to have a respectful conversation in which you give their opponent the respect that they're due is to have, like, a fair conversation. Or do you not think that's a good argument? I don't know.
Sure. I mean, respect. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know if it's...
I never read it like that, but...
Yeah, I don't know if it's, like, the most amazing argument, but I think... I don't know. Depending on what their role of the ballot is, like, a lot of role of the ballot's about, like, pedagogy and stuff. potentially it would make sense as a link turn to the role of the ballot because you care about having like a respectful dialogue in which each person's voice is recognized. I think the other argument that you can make is you can make arguments about how your shell sets a norm which outweighs marginal like losses in education in talking about the K in a particular instance. So, for example, if it's the case that someone read a KF, but they made all the cards 2-point font, you would say, if there's a norm that everyone doesn't read their cases in 2-point font, then in the long term we can have like more beneficial discussions about the K, which like outweighs on longevity and magnitude, since each conversation we have will be better. So that would be a weighing argument against what they claim will be this sort of loss of education in the particular round.
Yeah. A fourth argument that I don't think I've ever seen anyone read in a debate round, so talking about like innovation, here's your chance. Cut an article on NSD Update from a long time ago, actually no, maybe it's just a few years ago, by two people named Dorsil and Henson. I forget what it's called. If you look up like Dorsil and Henson NSD Update, it'll probably come up. Celine, can you just do that and tell me if the article comes up? The essential argument in the article, though, is that it is never good to like establish a norm in which critiques are rejected. In which theory is rejected. The reason being for this, that back in the days when there was no theory, judges would just intervene. Intervention is terrible for debate.
Theory and theory.
Yeah.
It's called Theory and Theory. Okay. Theory and Theory by that's a weird name. Anyway. The article also makes this like, it's not just an external impact to like why intervention is bad. There's also this claim about how the rise of critiques was made necessary by theory. The reason being that once debaters started like taking the rules of the activity into their own hands and establishing their own theory shells, it allowed people to start setting their own standards for what they wanted rounds to be like, and then that allowed critiques to flourish, because critiques are also people like reinventing the round, right? Having like a new conception of the round that challenges like a traditional conception of how the round should operate. So, if you have a world in which it is becomes the norm again for judges to just intervene against arguments that try to like reestablish standards for debate by saying that like they're always bad or they're going to use their own discretion for it, it's very plausible that that world would be just as bad for critiques as it would be for theory. I think this is kind of an interesting argument. So I'd recommend like cutting this article and reading it. People definitely won't be prepared for it, so they'll have to like think on their feet, which is always an advantage if you're reading an argument, because people aren't as good at thinking on their feet as they are reading blocks.
Yeah.
Right. Oh yeah. Do you want to talk about like the tricks?
Yeah. So the section's called tricks. They're not like tricks in the like
it's not bad tricks.
sense,
it's like
but they're just
tips
like,
and tricks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those kinds of tricks.
So I think the first thing is don't call fairness fairness. Debaters have this weird thing where if you call things something different, but it's the same thing, they don't realize it, and then they don't pull up their block. Like, that's really bad, like, that people don't do that, but it's the case. So if you call fairness something like in-round competitive equity or, like, equal access to the ballot, like, it makes it a lot easier to be persuasive, especially because judges are kind of conditioned to hear the, like, fairness for whom arguments, so if you switch it up, they're, like, less likely to be perceptually against you.
The other reason is that like so often like K debaters and like people reading critiques are going to try to like impact turn your conception of fairness. This is this is a good argument that they usually make. So the best way you want to get around it is by saying that oftentimes saying the problem is that the theory debater doesn't have a clear enough understanding of what fairness is, right? Like, you need to be very clear on what you think the fairness in your shell is before you're going to say, like, you know, the unfairness of excluding groups from debate is not bad, right? Like, what is your own conception of fairness, and, like, how is it more robustly justified than that? So I think, like, one step in that direction is, like, in-round competitive equity, right? So you need to not be framing your argument, obviously, in terms of, like, exclusion is ever an okay thing. But I think, like, end-run competitive equity is a little more specific than fairness at getting at exactly what fairness means in the context of theory shells, right? Like when you read a fairness voter, you're not talking about like general justice in the world at large, right? You're talking about like in round our ability to reach the ballot. So it might be that this gives you like a little more of a robust impact.
Yeah. The next thing is that you should link your standards to their role of the ballot, because K-debaters will often extend their role of the ballot and be like, my role of the ballot takes out theory. But if you have offense under their role of the ballot, them extending weighing arguments, for example, that their role of the ballot comes above fairness, means that your theory shell now also just operates on a higher level than fairness, like with their role of the ballot. And you should make weighing arguments for why your offense links better to their role of the ballot than they do. So if they have some sort of role of the ballot about like creating effective dialogue on like issues of structural violence, and you have offense that's like when you read your case in a 2-point font, no one knows what your evidence says, and that's pretty bad for effective dialogue. It's very easy to win comparative weighing arguments against the offense they have and the offense that you have. The other thing is that a lot of K-debaters make like sweeping arguments about the badness of theory that would logically apply to their critiques. So like I've seen people make arguments where they're like, rules are bad. And you're like, wait a second, what's a rule? Debaters may not ever read theory. So like if you are making claims that are like, we even have the same sort of offense. Like we are both making offensive arguments about why our particular methodology is something that is like good for minimizing oppression within the debate space. And you're like, the critique will have links, and those links functionally are rules that say you cannot do what the links are. So you're both just doing like comparison of rules, and so their sorts of arguments about how rules are like inherently bad and exclusionary just don't really make sense because they are also proposing rules for the debate community, and there's not really a substantive difference between the kinds of rules that you're proposing.
Wait, I didn't get that. Can you like give me an example?
Yeah, sure. So I like remember like when I would read theory against K-debaters, one of the arguments people would read is that like rules are bad because debaters need like flexibility and like creativity, and it's bad to put debaters in boxes. But like it doesn't seem to make sense to say debaters may not ever read theory because theory puts people in boxes. Because not reading theory would also similarly put you in a box, where it's like there's this particular strategy that you just don't have access to ever, like categorically. So the argument that they will try to go for is some sort of claim about a substantive difference between like the kind of arguments that the critique is making and the kind of arguments your theory shell is making. But if your offense is both linking to the same sort of framing issues, which are their role of the ballot, then like it just doesn't make sense what sort of substantive difference there would be between your theory shell and their critique. Because you can think of like a critique that talks about a particular type of discourse as like the logical equivalent of a theory shell that says a interpretation, like debaters may not use this specific rhetoric in debate. Like you're both proposing rules for the activity that like limit the kinds of arguments people have access to. It's just a question of if those rules are good, not if the idea in the abstract of rules is good or bad. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool.
I don't understand the next one, so you say it.
Oh, yeah. So this one is an argument that you can read, I think especially when you're reading T, which says that we should use agonistic pluralism. So agonistic pluralism just says that it's really important to have like a wide range of dialogue where we engage with views that are like super distinct from our own.
Is it when you read T or hit T?
When you read T. And so it is bad to like punish someone for trying to take like a distinct approach to the debate round or a distinct approach to a conversation because that sort of intellectual diversity is a necessary component of just like education in general and our engagement with other people. So your claim would be, even if theory is bad, it is good that you are contributing an alternate viewpoint to the conversation. So it would just flip, like, if they're having a criticism, it would just be, like, problematic for them to sort of punish you for trying to introduce a new viewpoint to the conversation, especially because critiques attempt to be this sort of, like, reformulation, or not all critiques, but a lot of them attempt to be, like, a new way of looking at things and a way of sort of, like, subverting norms. And your claim is, like, you're contributing something new to the conversation, and it just sort of flips the script for them to be like, no, you're not allowed to, like, change norms or contribute anything to the conversation. Does anyone have questions about that? Cool. The next argument that you can make is the claim that there's a fair version of the critique. This is like topical version of the AF for theory. So this is just in response, like, debaters will be like, oh, you're just trying to exclude my argument from the debate space and ensure that you never engage in, like, these sorts of positions. Your claim is like, no, once you meet this very particular norm, we can have a lot of important discussions about the issues that you've put forward. It's just a necessary prerequisite to engaging in those discussions that you, like, meet my interpretation. But your claim is that there's not, like, any sort of loss to the critique to meet your interpretation. We're still able to, like, have a fair version of it. We're able to have, like, just as good, if not better, dialogue.
Right, is that it for the tricks?
There's a restructuring theory to look like a K.
I've never done that. Has anyone never done that?
I did. The judge was not happy at all.
Really?
Like, it was horrendous.
Yeah.
Something to think about, though.
Yeah, I don't know if it's, like, the best idea, but I think it's interesting. You could try restructuring theory so that it looks like a K. My guess is that sometimes if you have, like, a good enough shell, people wouldn't really notice. If you're like, A is the link, like, you did not specify a roll-about weighing mechanism with, like, a clearly delineated roll-about text, like, we did that, then I think judges would be mad. You can potentially restructure a well-warranted theory shell about how they are really trying to get out of intellectual discussion in the format of a K. Because I think there's a lot more overlap with theory and critiques, which is why, like, a lot of the arguments people make as to why theory just generically comes first and K's generically come first just don't make a lot of sense.
One thing I wanted to add to, like, the arguments you can make side is, like, in addition to this probability weighing argument, one way you could frame it is, like, the probability of establishing a theoretical norm is significantly greater than the probability of establishing a critical norm, depending on the critique. So, like, what are the chances that, like, voting F in this one context is going to resolve capitalism? Or voting neg, given that, like, the cap K has been read, like, every tournament ever. Whereas, it seems much more plausible to argue that, like, theory standards are set more commonly, right? Like, disclosure and nibs bad, these are all norms that have entered debate because of theory. So that's one kind of type of weighing you can make. But, in general, here are all the arguments you can make. There are also probably many more. Here are the different tricks. The question is, how do you win the debate now? Well, some of it is the stuff I said in the beginning. So make lots of specific arguments. Try to be as little generic as little generic. Not as the less generic you can be, the better.
Yeah.
So second, make sure you're doing, like, lots of weighing. Don't just be asserting your fairness first arguments. Do explicit comparison between those and the education arguments. Coming out of the critique. Third.
All under theory versus K.
Yeah.
Third, I would put some defense on the critique. This is, like, actually essential, I think. You never want to have to be defending theory against, like, the full force of the critique, right? Like, conceded, link, impact, alternative, roll of the ballot, right? Because, again, you're just arguing, like, they have a massive strength of link advantage here. And also, like, a perceptual advantage. If you can, like, poke holes in, like, defensive spots in a few parts of the critique, it makes your job on theory, like, a lot more persuasive. Because you don't, like, it doesn't make it seem like you're arguing against some, like, conceded as true critique, right? It's the same way when, like, people read critiques, you still have to answer the AF, right? You still want to put defense on the AF. In the same way when you're reading theory shell against the critique, you still want to put defense on critiques, on the critique.
Yeah, I'd also add that if you're negating and you're reading, like, a tier theory shell, answer, like, every card in the AF you think there's a chance could take out theory. Especially if you're hitting, like, a postmodernism kind of high theory type AF, because there's a good chance they're going to stand up in the 1AR and for 2 minutes they're just going to read extensions of the AF to take out theory and T. And a lot of the times, like, even, like, really, really good K debaters will just extend the AF to take out T or theory without answering your line-by-line arguments. And so it's like, if their main strategy on T is, like, extensions of case, but they concede arguments you have on case, that also makes it much easier for you to win your access to your shell.
Definitely. The same thing goes for, like, this, like, truth value argument that was, like, you can assess the truth value of the criticism if there was no fairness, right? Like, oftentimes when people are responding to theory, they'll just extend the K and use it to impact turn theory. if you have like a conceded argument that you don't even know if the case is true first, that's like your silver bullet, right? The round should be over at that point. And the same, you can read that also in topicality when you're answering the AF. Because the same thing happens for people just trying to extend the AF evidence to impact guarantee. Your argument is you don't even know if the AF is true.
Yeah, I think the last thing is that you want to be perceptually ahead. So like, I just wouldn't read frivolous shells against critiques because like it just puts you in a really bad situation where the judge doesn't buy a lot of your arguments as being genuine because it's like, no, the debate definitely wasn't significantly skewed enough that we like don't know if the K is true or we like don't have the capacity to have a fair and educational discussion about it. You want to be able to sort of like have some overall story about how they were really trying to do something to get rid of critical education. So I think one example of this is sometimes people have advocacy texts that are like, we should do the resolution in order as like with the intention of, and then they'll insert some sort of like liberatory goal. And then you could be like, no, you weren't trying to have an interesting discussion about oppression. You were trying to extend your plan text and say, I fiat that the intention is to solve oppression. And be like, I saw you do this before when we debated, and you were going to do it again. Which means that you weren't trying to have like a good and educational debate. You were just trying to evade discussion. So trying to flip the script and making it seem like they're the one trying to get out of critical engagement rather than you.
So there are kids outside whipping each other with wood.
Oh, you're right.
Alright, don't worry. We're safe in here. Is everyone okay if I erase this? Anyone need it? Okay.
Does anyone have general questions about KB theory? Yeah.
Wait, can you explain how you like flip the discussion and like what you just talked about?
Yeah. So people, when they're reading critiques, they're going to want to try and frame it like you're reading theory to sort of like get out of this critical discussion because like you don't want to talk about the particular issues they're putting forward. You want to make the claim that like they didn't want to have the discussion and they were trying to use these sort of strategies that preclude a productive conversation. So a lot of things, I don't know, can you think of like good examples of things people would do?
No.
Or if someone read like didn't have an alt, or okay, this happened in one round that someone read a K against me, and I was like, you didn't read a link, and she was like, I'll read the link in the 2NR, and I was like, what? You can't read the link in the 2NR. Like then I can only answer links in the 2AR. So you
the future of critiques is just you read nothing, and then when they ask you about where your link impacts alt or roll the ballot is, you say it's all coming in the 2NR.
Yeah.
Just wait.
Yes. So something like that, you'd be like, wait. You wanted to engage in a critical discussion by reading links to the critique that you read in the NC in the 2NR, so I only have like 2 minutes to answer them. Like, you wanted to have a critical discussion, and I'm the one who's preventing you from doing that. So claims like that make it seem like they're just using these like tricks in order to get out of the conversation. Because I think a lot of the times people are. Like there are a lot of K debaters who like genuinely want to have an interesting conversation and aren't precluding you from engaging it. And in those situations, you shouldn't read theory. But there are a lot of people who put in tricks. And if you catch them, you should be like, this is a trick. They're saying that I'm trying to avoid the conversation, but then why did you put an a priori in your K? So, I think.
All right.
Yeah. Any other questions or?
Yeah. Final thoughts about this stuff? All right. So the last 20 minutes of this module is called Defending Justice. We're going to talk about defending the justice of theory shells against tricks, fairness not a voter, the Terry Narden evidence, the rule following paradox, many spikes. So, let's just jump in. So we're going to start with, I guess, fairness not a voter. Yeah. So who here has ever read theory and encountered fairness not a voter? Wow. All right. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Actually, who here has ever read fairness not a voter? Yeah. Okay. 2 more of us. So usually the fairness not a voter claims, at least to my ear, are not particularly persuasive, at least of a certain variety. Things like, you can't set norms during the round because the whole point of rules is that they have to be established before the round for me to know them. Arguments like this, right? But occasionally if you hit like a tricks debater, they'll like hit you with like a 10-point dump for why fairness is not a voter. So 2 strategies for this. One is I wouldn't discourage you from line by lining these arguments, depending on like how I'm sure they're low quality if they're like reading 10 of them, right? So don't be discouraged from reading theory because you're just going to lose on some really abusive substantive thing. So don't be discouraged by this. Always read theory. Chances are they might even understand their arguments less than you understand them, even though they read them, because these arguments are usually incoherent and of very poor quality. So don't be afraid to line by line them. And if like your response to one of them is like somewhat lacking, obviously try to make the best responses possible, but like chances are they're still not going to go for it. Because if they don't really understand what you said and you're responding to an argument that didn't really make any sense in the first place, they're probably just going to get confused and drop it. So 1, line by line it. 2, always make some kind of like overview-ish argument about why fairness has to be a voter. Why fairness has to be a voter. So I think the best argument to this effect is something along the lines of like all arguments presume fairness as some kind of theoretical standard. Like your ability to even say fairness not a voter is contingent on me allowing you to speak or you having time to even make arguments, which is itself a fairness claim, right? So every time you even say something in the debate round, you're making an assumption that you have the right to say that thing, which can only be justified by appeals to like competitive equity.
I think also the idea of desert in round, I think this also applies to things like SCEP. When they're making fairness not a voter arguments, like they're expecting that the judge will vote on them because presumably if you win arguments, then you deserve to win the round. But that also itself is a fairness claim. So for them to say that the judge should vote on their arguments because they deserve to win because they won the arguments is like self-defeating.
Yeah. Agreed.
I'm sorry, can you explain the words in those like reasons why all basically is fairness?
Well, think about like anything that allows a normal debate to happen, right? Stopping at the speech times, not dropped arguments or true arguments, right? Or like just speaking in the first place, right? These are all arguments that could be argued presuppose fairness. Because like, what is preventing me from just like putting my hand over your mouth while you talk, right? It's unfair.
In
right?
response to that, a lot is stopping you from like,
Sure, but like there have to be some rules, right?
Yeah.
This isn't anarchy, it's debate.
Oh, also, okay, whenever people are answering things that are rules, they just make rules that rules are bad, and it never makes sense. A lot of fairness and voter arguments will be circular. Like, they're like, it is bad to impose rules on debate. Theory is always bad. And you're like, what's that? Like, a rule? So, I think, yeah, making arguments about how their claims are self-defeating is good. Yeah.
Can you repeat the dessert argument?
Sure. So the claim is like, when you are putting forward arguments in a debate, with the intention of the judge voting on them if the arguments are won, your belief that the judge should vote for you if you're winning the debate round is contingent on the idea of fairness, because you believe that the person who wins is someone who should deserve to win, like based on the particular arguments that they're ahead on. But that itself like presumes that fairness matters, because like it would be the reason that it would be bad for the judge to vote for the person who loses every single argument on the flow is because it's unfair to the person who did better debating. So for the judge to vote on skepticism, not skep, well also skep. For the judge to vote on fairness on a voter, then they would have to like believe that fairness matters to a certain degree, in which case fairness on a voter is false. Does that make sense?
All right. Any last questions about fairness on a voter before we move on? All right. Raise your hand if you've ever read the Narden evidence. Raise your hand if you've ever hit the Narden evidence in a debate round. Okay, so what did it say?
I still don't know.
Did you raise your hand?
No, I mean, like, I read it.
Oh, okay. I understand. Arlo?
It basically says that the rules of the activity, or like pragmatic benefits of the activity, are constrained by by the rules that are constitutive of the activity. So, like chess, even if like taking the knight away from someone would result in a more more intellectually challenging game, that wouldn't be good because it wouldn't be constitutive of the rules.
Sure. So the argument is you have to be consistent with the like rules of the activity. All right. So this could be used to take out theory, because theory is going to say like we should add all of these other rules onto it, whereas this is going to say all we need is the rule handbook and that's it. Everything else is just like imposing additional rules. Like, if you're playing chess with someone and you're like, new rule, pawns can move 3 spaces, right? Things like that. So unfair additions of rules are not allowed. So any intuitive objections people have to this or thoughts they have on it? No, we're all Nardin believers. That's sad. Okay.
Isn't it adding a new location that you can't add rules?
Maybe, but I think the more plausible way they'll construct it is more just like anything additional. It's not that they're saying a rule that you can't add rules, but rather they're saying that when you try to add an extra rule, there's just no force to it, right? Like it doesn't have any impact because it's not based in the handbook. But that's not a bad argument to make either way. Anything else? All right. Well, like one argument that always seemed intuitive to me is that like debate isn't chess. I think this is like a somewhat devastating response. So like, for one thing, debate is a speaking activity by which we make arguments. In fact, the way you do debate is by making arguments. That's like the fundamental way that debate operates. You make arguments. That is not how chess operates. So there seems to be whenever people try to make like comparisons between like debate and soccer or debate and chess, get suspicious because like clearly there's some very, very fundamental key component of this activity that separates it. Yes, we're both competitive activities, but in one of them, you can make arguments, and through the process of making arguments, you can change norms because those arguments carry weight, right? So the reason, yes, you cannot change rules in something like chess or soccer in the middle, but because you can make arguments for things and try to persuade people of things, there is some key component of debate that allows us to make rules because of argumentation. Okay, the second argument I think is good to make against this is, believe it or not, the Schmagency objection. So who here has ever heard of the Schmagency objection in the context of like a Kant framework? All right, Andrew, you want to explain it in very simple terms?
Basically, we can, like, even if there are constitutive obligations that we have, we could escape those obligations by becoming something else, kind of.
Yeah, that's true. So I'm not going to go into like explaining it in the context of Kant, but in the context of this, so like Enoch even talks about chess in his article, right? So like I would discard this and read it against Nardin. But so like why do we care about playing chess, the original activity? Why? There's no good reason in the Nardin evidence for why we have to be doing like NSDA handbook debate, right? So the argument is, if you were to break the rules of the activity, you would just be doing a different activity. Like, you're not even doing debate at that point, in which case you're not constrained by the rules, right? So there's no reason for why what we are doing, like in this round, has to be like an NSDA debate round guided by the rule book. It could be like a schmabate round, right, to use Enoch's own like wording. So it runs into this problem of not telling us why we're like constrained by the rules. Because if we were to violate the rules, you could just argue that you're doing like a new form of the activity that has its own rules. For example, no, I'm just playing a new game. It's not chess. It's called Schmess, and pawns move 3 spaces, right? So those are similar problems for both of them. What's the last thing? There's like a link to an article in here.
There's the International Debate Education Association has an article. It's called like Rules Lincoln Douglas. And they're like, good debaters call out unfair debaters. So you can just card that and be like, the IDA outweighs, or I guess it's called IDEA. You're like, they outweigh since they make the rules. Yeah, I always cut that to read against trick debaters.
Sorry.
It's just like, debate presumes equal engagement. A good debater would call out an unfair distribution of burdens or something like that. I mean, the point is not that it's like an amazing article by the International Debate Education Association. It's just that like they're the one. It's like literally a document on what the rules are at LD. So you could be like, wait, I have carded evidence from this debate institution that says what the rules are. That seems to like outweigh your speculation about truth testing being like the role of the debate round. So you can just make pretty easy weighing arguments with that.
All right. you want to talk about spikes for a little bit?
Sure. So we're just going to go through some of the spikes that you guys should watch out for, and some general strategies that you guys should be using when you are hitting a case that has a ton of spikes in it. So here are some spikes to watch out for, because if you drop them, you'll probably lose or be at a really significant disadvantage on theory. So the first one is that neg must have one unconditional route to the ballot. This means both nothing and everything, depending on what your strategy is, which is why you have to really watch out for it. Because one unconditional route to the ballot doesn't mean anything, which means that if you read 2 case turns, they can extend this in the 1AR and be like, you can collapse to one of the case turns, which links in, or it can mean you can't have a counter plan and the status quo, or it can mean you can't read theory and substance. So definitely make sure to answer it. The next thing is that, so yesterday I talked about how if people have arguments about side bias in the app, you should always link turn them in order to access things like presumption and delink their access to spikes. But there will be a lot of claims inside of side bias arguments that say that statistics outweigh speculation, because there are statistics that say that it's harder to affirm.
Also, must weigh against side bias is a really common spike that you'll have to look out for if you're reading theory.
Yeah, so don't drop either of those things, because I've lost rounds because I made arguments it's harder to negate but didn't have a statistic and dropped that argument.
The other thing is, if they say must weigh against side bias, you could just concede this argument and then turn side bias and argue why it goes your way, and then if they have to make 1AR theory, then they're the ones that have to weigh it against side bias, or else they would lose.
Yep.
So turn it into an argument for yourself.
Yeah.
What is side bias?
Side bias is just whether it's harder to affirm or negate. So there's side bias if one side, just by virtue of walking into the round, is at some kind of competitive disadvantage.
Yep. And then this one's kind of died, which is good, but sometimes people like to bring it back. So this says all neg interps are counter interps, which doesn't mean so the idea is just well, an interp comes before a counter interp, and whenever you read an AF, you implicitly think everything you did was okay. So there are all these implicit interpretations in the AC about how the AF practices were good, and then any neg interpretation is a counter interp that says, no, what you think was okay is not actually okay. This doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, if you're confused by this argument,
doesn't make
that's
any
okay.
sense.
It's incoherent.
Yes.
I am confused by this argument.
I think the reason people think it is because it lies on the false belief that what distinguishes an interp and a counter interp is the order in which they happen. But that's just not the case. If you read a counter interp that's when you read a plan that's I may read a plan in the app, that does not become an offensive argument because you did it first. An interp is something that is offensive that says you did something practically bad that has a violation. So obviously if you have a violation and a practical rule, it's not a counter interp.
And the second problem with it is that there's no such thing as an implicit interpretation.
Yeah.
You can't it's the same thing with the K. You stand up. My links were implicit.
Yeah.
So was the alt and the roll of the ballot and the impact.
Yeah, if you look really closely. Yeah. Cool.
All right. Okay, one general strategy for responding to spikes is to cut this article that our very own Marshall Thompson wrote. It's called, I think, Thoughts from the Disorganized Mind of Marshall or something. And he gives some very compelling reasons for why spikes are bad, both for dyslexic debaters and because they don't track the better debater, and because when you extend a spike to mean something different than it meant before, then it's clearly a new argument. Yeah, it's a new argument if it means something different to your opponent. So you could always just read this and say give me new 2NR responses for these few reasons. All right, I'll just blaze through the last few things about spikes we wanted to say. So practice reading responses to the common spikes to get really efficient. It should never take you more than you should have a set amount of time to respond to these. You shouldn't be wasting a ton of your time on one uncondo route to the ballot. Point out why it's a terrible norm for debate and move on. So practice answering the common spikes like this. So always deal with the spikes right when you get to case. If you put them at the bottom, there's a higher likelihood you'll drop them. So they should always be the first thing you deal with. Bless you. Additionally, consider reading counter-interps to a lot of the offensive spikes and then also attaching RVIs to them. This is really good because like oftentimes these are just throwaway arguments that people don't actually want to have to go for. So if you just like throw in an RVI in the 1NC after reading a counter-interp to a spike, they now have to deal with it in the 1AR, which becomes extremely difficult for them. Okay, another great strategy if you want to turn spikes into offense for you is reading U-bites and I-meets. So like reasons for why they bite their own theory shell and then reasons for why you meet the theory shell, right? So that automatically turns it into offense. Or you could just do U-bites. Like if people read multiple uncondo routes to the ballot, I would always be like you bite because you had multiple contentions in your AF, so you also had different routes to the ballot. So things like that. Last thing, you can read theory on spikes. So spikes bad, must disclose spikes, or like some specific combination of spikes is bad. For example, if you were to read all neg interps or counter-interps and then also deny the neg and RVI, that's extraordinarily abusive because you're saying the only way you can read theory is as a counter-interp, but also you can't get offense from counter-interps, so it would literally be impossible to win on theory ever. Okay, that was fast. If you have any questions about any of those things, come up to us afterwards and ask. But so yeah, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Talk about the last section of our theory module.